Hey guys, tonight we're talking about Adolf Hitler, a man remembered for many terrible things, and rather unexpectedly, for having one of the most famous medicine cabinets in history. By the end of the war, that cabinet included methamphetamine, powerful opioids, cocaine, hormones, stimulants, and a remarkable number of injections, which at first glance sounds completely insane. The awkward question is whether it sounded insane at the time, and for that, we begin in 1944 with a doctor staring at a handful of small black pills and wondering whether Adolf Hitler was slowly poisoning himself. The doctor was Erwin Giesing, an ear, nose and throat specialist brought in after the July 20th bomb plot damaged Hitler's ears. His job should have been fairly simple: examine the ears, treat the injuries, and eventually disappear back into normal medical life. Instead, treating Hitler kept him around long enough to notice the rest of the routine, and the ears, as it turned out, were probably the least complicated part of the patient. What caught Giesing's attention were the gas pills. Hitler had been swallowing them for years because his stomach had never quite agreed with the rest of him. They were called Dr. Köster's anti-gas pills, small black tablets taken for bloating and intestinal discomfort. Giesing wanted to know what was inside. The answer included belladonna and strychnine, which is a wonderfully efficient way to make a medicine cabinet look guilty. Belladonna had been associated with poison for centuries, while strychnine would eventually become much better known from murder stories than from medicine. Hitler was taking both. Giesing began to worry. The awkward part is that belladonna was still medicine in 1944, so was strychnine, in small doses. Hitler was unquestionably taking a lot of drugs. The much better question is whether a doctor living in his own time would have thought the treatment was insane. Giesing was about to find out because once he raised the issue, other doctors around Hitler began taking an interest too. One of them was Karl Brandt, a senior doctor in Hitler's medical circle who already had his own doubts about Morell. When Giesing raised the alarm over the pills, Brandt took it seriously. The disagreement would eventually become a medical feud. But before we get there, we have to leave the black pills on the table and go back 8 years. Because in 1936, Morell was not yet the notorious doctor with the overflowing medicine case. He was the man who seemed to fix Hitler's stomach, which admittedly is a less glamorous beginning. Hitler had suffered for years from cramps, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, and a truly unfortunate amount of gas. For a man trying to rebuild Germany in his own image, he was spending a surprising amount of time thinking about his intestines. Speeches could be rehearsed, meetings could be arranged, entire rooms could be organized around his preferences. He had tried diets, he had seen doctors. The complaints kept returning. Hitler's digestive system had declared a private war of its own. Then Theodor Morell was introduced to him. The same Morell we have already met in 1944 was, at this point, simply a successful Berlin physician with wealthy patients and a strong belief in treatment. He was heavy, often described as somewhat unkempt, and he would later become deeply unpopular with people around Hitler who complained about his hygiene, his smell, his habits, and eventually his medicine. He was not an elegant man. He did, however, have the confidence of the kind of doctor who could make you feel slightly better before the treatment had even started. And when you have spent years complaining about your stomach, that can be very persuasive. Morell listened to Hitler, treated the complaints as something that could be solved, and began investigating the intestines. He had Hitler's stool examined and became interested in what was happening inside the gut. One of the treatments he settled on was Mutaflor, a preparation containing a live strain of Escherichia coli, which sounds like exactly the moment you would want a different doctor. Except Mutaflor was not one of Morell's inventions. The bacterium had been isolated by the German physician Alfred Nissl during the First World War, and by the time Morell arrived, doctors had been using the preparation for intestinal problems for years. So Morell's first great success with Hitler did not begin with cocaine, methamphetamine, or some mysterious injection. It began with a stomach remedy that, inconveniently for the more exciting version of this story, was fairly respectable medicine. And Hitler thought it worked. The surviving medical accounts describe his digestion improving. His eczema also improved over the following months and he gained weight. That does not tell us exactly which treatment caused what. It does not prove Morell understood the underlying problem, but Hitler was not asking for a controlled trial. He wanted his stomach to stop ruining his day, and as far as he was concerned, Morell had managed it. Congratulations, The new doctor had just made himself very difficult to get rid of. Morell was no longer simply another physician passing through. He became the doctor Hitler trusted to keep him functioning, and Morell was very well suited to that role. He was not a doctor who liked leaving a complaint alone. If Hitler felt unwell, Morell usually tried something. If it seemed to help, that became one more reason to trust him the next time. So the famous medicine cabinet did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. One apparent success made the next treatment easier to accept, and before long Morell was no longer just treating isolated problems. He was becoming part of the way Hitler expected those problems to be solved. Mutaflor was surprisingly easy to defend, which meant the medicine cabinet was not going to give us an easy answer. If Morell was going to become difficult to defend, it would have to be for something more revealing than a strange name on a bottle. That was the problem with Morell's first success. It worked. Or at least Hitler thought it did, and once a patient decides that one particular doctor can make him feel functional again, the relationship changes. Morell was no longer just the man who had helped with the stomach. He became the man Hitler called when something was wrong, and Hitler had a remarkable number of things that could feel wrong. He could be tired, run down, cold, bloated, unable to sleep, weak before a speech, exhausted after travel, or simply not as effective as he expected himself to be. Those are awkward complaints for a doctor, because they are real enough to bother the patient and vague enough to leave plenty of room for interpretation. Morell liked room. He had a strong instinct to intervene. If Hitler felt depleted, Morell looked for something that might restore him. If he needed to keep going, Morell looked for something that might help him keep going. There was even a respectable word for the goal, Leistungsfähigkeit, your capacity to perform, and this is where Morell becomes more interesting than the medicines, because once the problem is no longer a clearly defined disease but the broader feeling that the patient is not functioning at the level he expects, the range of possible treatments becomes enormous. At first, the evidence against Morell is disappointingly weak. Intravenous glucose sounds dramatic because there is a needle involved. But by the 1930s, intravenous dextrose had been used medically for years. Doctors discussed doses, concentrations and indications in ordinary journals. Hospitals used it. Physicians used it outside hospitals. The needle looked more suspicious than the medicine. Vitamins were not much better evidence. The familiar image of Morell hovering over Hitler with a syringe can be misleading. A syringe looks aggressive on screen. Medically, what was inside it and why it was being given matter much more. Then Morell's ambitions widened. He became interested not only in treating obvious illness, but in restoring strength, resistance, energy, and general performance. That took him toward hormones. Again, the date refuses to cooperate with the sensational version. Hormones were one of the exciting new frontiers of 1930s medicine. Researchers were learning how tiny glands could influence growth, metabolism, reproduction, and energy. Testosterone had been identified and synthesized. Pharmaceutical companies were already turning these discoveries into products. Medicine had discovered that the body was full of chemical instructions. Naturally, people became very interested in giving it some new ones. So a doctor using hormones in the middle of the 1930s was not automatically practicing fringe medicine. In some cases, he was standing very close to the cutting edge. The stranger-looking preparations came from animal glands and organs. Morell used products connected with adrenal tissue, liver, prostate and other parts of the animal body, sometimes combined with vitamins or sold as restoratives. That sounds like the point where the whole thing should finally collapse into quackery. It does not. Doctors had been experimenting with organ extracts for decades. The basic logic was simple. If removing a gland caused a particular problem, perhaps something from that gland could help correct it. Sometimes that worked. Thyroid extract became a real treatment, and one genuine success has always been very good at encouraging 10 more hopeful ideas. By the 1920s, manufacturers were selling preparations made from all sorts of glands and tissues, and this is where the contemporary medical literature becomes much more useful than the drug list. Doctors were already fighting about exactly how far this enthusiasm should go. In 1922, a JAMA review mocked one organotherapy book as essentially a salesman's aid for glandular products. It complained about uncritical hormone enthusiasm, weak use of scientific literature, and manufacturers promoting what it called shotgun pluriglandular products. 3 years later, another JAMA piece again attacked the widespread use of shotgun preparations, made from multiple endocrine glands. This is important because Morell had not even entered Hitler's life yet. The argument was already happening, and by 1935, the year before Morell became Hitler's doctor, the profession was drawing the line even more explicitly. Jamer published a paper called The Uses and Abuses of Modern Gland Products. The title is almost too useful. Not uses or nonsense. Uses and abuses. The author's point was not that endocrinology was fraudulent, quite the opposite. He described modern endocrinology as one of the great recent achievements of physiology. The problem was knowing when a hormone treatment was rational, and when the same scientific excitement was being stretched into something the evidence could not support. The same issue of the journal carried another article on commercial glandular products. Its opening complaint was brutal. Almost every gland, organ and body fluid seemed to have been dried, extracted, put into pills, tablets, vials or ampules, and sold with claims far beyond what was known to be active. This is where Morell becomes harder to dismiss as a simple quack. The animal extracts themselves are not the decisive evidence. The more revealing problem is that respectable medicine had already identified a dangerous temptation. One successful hormone treatment could become an excuse to use gland products for a much wider range of vague complaints, from weakness and fatigue to mood, circulation, recovery and digestion. And Morell's treatment style starts to look uncomfortably familiar inside that debate. He used real modern hormone preparations. He also used glandular products when Hitler felt weak, tired, low, run down, or simply needed restoring. Take cortiron, an adrenal-related preparation. Morell used it in connection with weakness and metabolic effects. Other hormone and gland products appear when Hitler needed energy, recovery, or a lift. One male reproductive tissue preparation appears in Morell's medical world in connection with fatigue or low mood, rather than a clearly demonstrated deficiency of the organ system it came from. That distinction matters more than whether the bottle sounds strange today. A legitimate medicine used for a precise problem is one thing. Turning it into a general answer to "I do not feel good enough today" is something else. And Hitler's life supplied Morell with endless versions of that complaint. Speeches ran for hours, meetings stretched late into the night, travel was exhausting, political life rewarded the appearance of inexhaustibility, whether or not the person involved actually possessed any. Whenever Hitler felt below the level he expected from himself, Morell had something to try. What finally convinced me that this was not simply a bizarre treatment plan invented for Hitler was Albert Speer. Speer later remembered visiting Morell in 1936 because his circulation and stomach were rebelling against an absurd work schedule. Morell examined him and prescribed a familiar package: intestinal bacteria, dextrose, vitamins, and hormone tablets. Speer then went to Professor von Bergmann, a respected Berlin internist, for a more thorough examination. Von Bergmann found no organic disease. His diagnosis was essentially overwork. Speer slowed down, the symptoms improved, and because Hitler had recommended Morell so enthusiastically, Speer says he pretended that he was still following Morell's treatment and briefly became one of Morell's success stories. That is a revealing little episode. It does not prove Morell's treatments were useless, and Speer's memoir is not a controlled experiment, but it does suggest a pattern. Morell seems to have approached other patients with the same restorative toolkit he later used so heavily around Hitler. This may simply have been how Morell practiced medicine. A later British medical journal review described him as a fashionable type of practitioner that was not uncommon in the first half of the 20th century, fond of polypharmacy, newly introduced drugs, injections, non-specific hormonal treatment and tissue therapy. That description is more revealing than calling him a mad doctor. A recognizable kind of physician practicing at the enthusiastic edge of respectable medicine is much harder to dismiss, and Hitler may have been the perfect patient for him. He wanted relief quickly. He valued the ability to keep functioning. He trusted the doctor who seemed able to provide it, and unlike Speer, he did not go away, slow down, and quietly decide that overwork might be part of the problem. He kept Morell beside him for years. Karl Brandt, one of the physicians who later became one of Morell's most persistent critics, objected to something similar. Brandt did not claim that every medicine Morell touched was fraudulent. His complaint was that Morell embraced new drugs too readily, sometimes at high doses, before there was enough wider experience with them. Brandt was a rival, so he cannot be treated as a neutral judge. But his criticism matters because it sounds remarkably similar to what medical journals had already been warning about before Morell ever met Hitler. That is where Morell starts looking genuinely questionable, not because he believed in hormones, not because he liked injections, not because some of his treatments sound ridiculous when translated into modern language, because his confidence in when to intervene was beginning to move faster than the evidence underneath it. And the spear comparison adds one more uncomfortable possibility. Maybe Hitler was not receiving uniquely insane medicine. Maybe he was receiving unusually prolonged exposure to a doctor whose normal style was already unusually interventionist. Once Hitler decided that this was the man who kept him functioning, there was very little incentive for Morell to become less enthusiastic. Still, there was one obvious escape for the simpler version of the story. Maybe all this ambiguity around restorative medicine was just background noise. Maybe the real answer was Pervitin. In December 1944, Theodor Morell warned one of his patients not to rely on Pervitin. His point was simple. The drug did not replace lost energy. It merely forced the body to keep going. Morell compared it to the difference between a carrot and a stick. Pervitin was the stick. That is a slightly awkward thing to find in the correspondence of the doctor, who is now famous for supposedly keeping Hitler running on methamphetamine. And it immediately creates a problem. If Morell himself understood what Pervitin could do, how much was he actually giving Hitler? This should have been the easy part. It was not. Pervitin had entered Germany in 1938 as a modern pharmaceutical stimulant. Temmler marketed it for fatigue, low energy and poor performance. Doctors received samples, and patients could buy it far more easily than they could a few years later. At that moment, methamphetamine had not yet acquired the medical reputation it would have by the end of the war. So if Morell had used Pervitin in 1938, the drug name alone would not have made him extraordinary. But Germany's attitude changed quickly. Military physician Otto Ranke tested Pervitin as a way of keeping exhausted soldiers awake and functioning. Even while exploring its usefulness, he was warning about abuse, dependence, and poor control over how it was being used. By 1941, Pervitin had been brought under tighter prescription and narcotics control. By the following year, German medical literature was discussing addiction and intoxication. So, meth was legal then, is not a very satisfying answer. It was true for a while, but medicine changed its mind quickly, and Morell clearly understood that by the end of the war. Which brings us back to Hitler. For a drug that sits at the centre of the modern Hitler drug legend, Pervitin, is surprisingly difficult to find in Morell's surviving notes. The obvious expectation is pages full of it. Instead, explicit references are sparse. Some historians argue that Hitler received Pervitin directly on at least one occasion. Others reconstruct more regular exposure through preparations such as Vitamultin forte, on the theory that the stronger version contained amphetamine. The problem is that the exact composition of that preparation is not secure enough to carry the whole argument by itself. There is even disagreement over whether one disputed diary reference was really Pervitin or another product with a similar-looking name. The drug is famous. The paper trail is strangely shy. That gap matters more than the mythology around it. A claim does not become better documented simply because it has been repeated for decades. Hitler may well have received methamphetamine, but the image of him spending the war permanently fueled by it is much easier to repeat than it is to prove. The popular story gets ahead of the evidence here. The surviving record supports possible Pervitin exposure. It does not comfortably support the legend of a man spending the war continuously powered by meth. And once that story is familiar enough, later behaviour becomes very easy to read through it. Energy as stimulation, exhaustion as withdrawal, irritability as pharmacology. The records do not become clearer just because the theory is satisfying. What makes Morell's own 1944 warning so useful is that it removes another easy excuse. He knew Pervitin was not simply restoring energy. He knew it was borrowing from the body. So if he was still using it on Hitler late in the war, the different era argument loses much of its force. By then the warnings were in the medical literature, the regulations had changed, and Morell himself understood the basic problem. Yet even here, Pervitin refuses to become the clean smoking gun people expect. The danger was real, and so was Morell's awareness of it, but the evidence for Hitler's sustained methamphetamine use is still much thinner than the legend built around it. which leaves the story in a strange position. The drug everybody expects to explain everything turns out to be one of the least securely documented parts of it. There was, however, another substance in Morell's records where the problem was different. Its danger was already well known, and the evidence of repeated use was much harder to avoid. Eukodal. If Pervitin refused to become the clean answer, Eukodal looked much more promising. Oxycodone. This was different. By the time Morell used it on Hitler, Eukodal had been in medicine for decades. Its dependence risk was already known, and Germany had treated oxycodone as a controlled narcotic for years. This looks like the moment where Morell should finally become easy to judge. Then I read the entry from July 18th, 1943. Hitler was preparing to meet Mussolini. He was also in severe abdominal pain. Morell described a distended abdomen full of gas, extreme nervous tension, and almost no sleep for several days. And what caught my attention was not that Morell immediately reached for Eukodal. He did the opposite. He wrote that he could not give Hitler a narcotic because important conferences and decisions still lay ahead. So he tried other things first. Eupaverin, massage, treatment for the abdominal distension, even olive oil. The narcotic stayed out of the picture. Only later, when Hitler was still looking very ill and faint before leaving for the airfield, did Morell give an intramuscular ampule of Eukodal. That is not the scene the famous version prepares you for. The famous version makes Eukodal sound like the moment Morell discovered a chemical button that could turn Hitler back on. The diary entry is less convenient. It shows genuine pain, a doctor worried that a narcotic might interfere with judgment, and a drug he only used after other measures had failed. So the first documented injection is not the smoking gun it appears to be. But Eukodal creates a different problem. Unlike some of the earlier treatments, its danger was not hidden behind an immature science. Oxycodone had entered German medicine around the end of the First World War as a strong analgesic and cough suppressant, and reports of euphoria, abuse and dependence appeared early. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, medical writing was already discussing Eukodal addiction strongly enough to give it a name, Eukodalism. Germany had also placed oxycodone under narcotics control well before Morell began giving it to Hitler. That changes the significance of what comes next, because Morell used Eukodal again, and at least some later entries still describe genuine symptoms. In November 1944 he recorded abdominal distension, pain near the sternum and severe nervous tension. He gave Eukodal with Eupaverin. The pain and cramp, according to the note, improved immediately. The evidence does not support the cartoon version in which Morell was simply shooting Hitler full of opioids, because both men enjoyed the result. Some injections still had a legitimate medical reason. What becomes harder to defend is how easily that reason could recur. About 24 explicit Eukodal injections are commonly identified in Morell's records. Some historians think there were more, because certain entries marked only with an X may also refer to Eukodal. That identification needs caution. An ambiguous mark should stay ambiguous unless the surrounding evidence makes the identification secure. The exact total is not the most interesting dispute. Repeated exposure is already there. What matters is what that fact can actually support. The Hitler drug story often stacks conclusions too quickly. Repeated Eukodal use is well documented, physical dependence is plausible, addiction is harder to establish, and using opioids to explain Hitler's military decisions or final collapse is a much larger claim again. The further that chain extends, the weaker the ground becomes. That caution matters because the July 1943 Mussolini meeting has become one of the most dramatic scenes in the whole story. The familiar version goes roughly like this. Morell gives Eukodal, Hitler transforms, dominates the meeting, and the injection helps change history. It is a very satisfying chain of cause and effect. Possibly too satisfying. Morell's own note begins with severe abdominal pain, and with Morell actively trying not to narcotize Hitler before important decisions. That does not mean Eukodal had no effect on Hitler's mood or performance. A powerful opioid can relieve pain and distress, and it can produce euphoria. But the record does not let us draw a clean line from one injection to the fate of Italy. The more interesting thing is smaller and more revealing. Morell knew the drug was powerful enough to interfere with judgment, and he knew the profession already regarded it as dependence-forming, yet he kept returning to it. That is where Morell becomes much harder to defend. The problem is no longer ignorance, it is restraint. A doctor can have a perfectly good reason to use a strong painkiller once. The harder question is what happens after the patient learns that the injection works quickly. The doctor knows exactly how to provide it, and another difficult day inevitably arrives. Morell does not cross a bright line in one cinematic moment. He moves toward it gradually. A painful episode produces immediate relief, another difficult day arrives, and a controlled narcotic with a legitimate medical purpose becomes one more tool inside a much larger system for keeping Hitler functional. That is difficult to defend even by the standards of Morell's own time. A doctor who understood both Eukodal's usefulness and its danger kept finding reasons to return to it. And by this point, another possibility was becoming difficult to ignore. Maybe no single drug was ever going to explain what was strange about Hitler's treatment. Maybe the real story was what happened when all of them belonged to the same doctor. By this point, the drug list is starting to look like a distraction. The hormones were more respectable than they looked. Pervitin was less securely documented than the legend suggested. Eukodal had legitimate reasons to be used, even if the later pattern became harder to defend. One by one, the bottles keep refusing to give a clean answer, so the more revealing question is no longer what sat inside the medicine cabinet. Between 1941 and 1945, Morell prescribed Hitler at least 92 different medications, and gave him more than 1,000 intravenous or intramuscular injections. The number is impressive, obviously, but the number itself is not the revealing part. What matters is what those injections were increasingly for. Morell's notes sometimes describe them with an almost boring familiarity. Injection as always. That phrase is more revealing than any exotic drug name. An injection had become ordinary enough that it no longer needed much explanation. And once you start reading the records that way, the treatment begins to look less like a series of isolated medical decisions, and more like a routine built around one goal: keep Hitler functioning. In March 1944, for example, Morell described him after a sleepless night as limp, tired and obviously below his usual capacity. He gave him Vitamultin Forte, and not long afterward Hitler appeared noticeably fresher and was able to continue with talks and conversation. The exact contents of every preparation matter, of course, but this particular scene interests me for a different reason. Hitler is tired, Morell intervenes, Hitler appears fresher, and the work continues. It is a very efficient way for both doctor and patient to learn the same lesson. Do it again next time. Next time came often, and Karl Brandt later described how Morell gradually moved more and more of Hitler's treatment toward injections. Brandt was one of Morell's rivals, so every complaint needs to be weighed with that hostility in mind. But one part of his description is especially interesting because it changes what the injections were actually trying to accomplish. According to Brandt, if Hitler felt a cold coming on, Morell might give several injections over the course of a day. That is already fairly interventionist, but then the timing moved earlier. If Hitler had to give a speech and the weather was expected to be cold or rainy, Brandt said Morell could begin injecting him before the speech, continue on the day itself, and sometimes continue afterward. The illness no longer had to arrive. The possibility that Hitler might become ill, tired, or less effective was enough. That is where the story changes. Treating a cold is one thing, but preparing a patient medically because bad weather might reduce his performance means the target is no longer simply disease. The target is uninterrupted function. And that makes the word Leistungsfähigkeit from earlier suddenly much more important. Morell was not only trying to make Hitler healthy, he was trying to keep him usable. That sounds like a small distinction, but it is not. If a doctor's job becomes preventing any dip in the patient's ability to work, then the threshold for treatment can keep moving downward. You no longer need a diagnosis. A demanding schedule, a bad night, a long journey, a speech, the beginning of a cold, or simply the fear that tomorrow might be difficult can all become reasons to intervene. And Hitler's life produced those situations constantly. This is also where Hitler stops looking like a passive victim of Morell's enthusiasm. The surviving accounts suggest that Hitler liked immediate results, believed Morell could produce them, and sometimes requested injections himself. And the more often a treatment seemed to restore him quickly, the more valuable Morell became. That matters because it changes the relationship. The easy version imagines Morell as a rogue doctor endlessly drugging an unsuspecting patient. The evidence is more uncomfortable. Hitler appears to have rewarded exactly the style of medicine that made Morell increasingly interventionist. If an injection allowed Hitler to continue a meeting after a bad night or get through a speech, it counted as success in the moment. Long-term wisdom mattered less than the immediate question: could he function now? Morell usually had something to offer. That creates a feedback loop in which rapid relief increases. Hitler's trust, Morell's confidence grows with it, and the next complaint arrives with even less reason to wait. This may be one of the most important things in the whole story, because it explains how an enormous treatment regime can develop without either man ever having to decide in one dramatic moment that they are creating one. Nobody needs to announce a plan for dozens of medicines and more than 1,000 injections. A stomach treatment seems to work. An injection helps after a bad night. A painkiller brings relief, and each apparent success makes the next intervention easier to justify, until the exceptional becomes routine. That is why the raw number matters without needing to become spectacle. More than 1,000 injections represent more than quantity. They represent hundreds of moments when a problem, or even the anticipation of one, was answered with medical intervention. That changes the kind of relationship we are looking at, and it is where the famous Hitler was on everything framing starts becoming actively unhelpful. Because once the story becomes a long list of chemicals, every substance starts to look equally important, even though a vitamin injection is not Eukodal, a bacterial preparation is not Pervitin, and topical cocaine is not recreational cocaine use. The list flattens all of that into one impressive pile, while Morell's actual pattern is more revealing. He had different tools for different situations, but the common feature was his willingness to use them. Frequently, quickly, and increasingly before a problem had fully developed. That is where the abnormality may actually sit. Not in the existence of one outrageous drug, but in the expectation that medicine should always be able to produce a functioning Hitler on demand. There is another reason Morell is difficult to dismiss as simply irrational. This kind of medicine had a logic. Hitler's schedule really was punishing. He slept badly, suffered recurrent stomach problems, and repeatedly experienced pain, exhaustion, and periods of feeling unwell. And a doctor standing beside him every day would naturally see those complaints. Morell's mistake, if that is what we are looking at, may not have been inventing symptoms that did not exist. It may have been developing almost no tolerance for leaving them alone. That is a very different criticism, and a more convincing one. It also explains why Morell could remain persuasive for so long. A doctor who says, "You're exhausted because you are overworked. Sleep more and cancel tomorrow's meetings," is medically useful but politically inconvenient. A doctor who says, "I can give you something," has a much better chance of becoming indispensable to a patient who does not intend to slow down. Albert Speer gives us a useful contrast. When another physician told Speer that overwork was the problem, Speer says he slowed down and improved. Hitler never really had an equivalent phase, or perhaps more accurately, he did not want one. The demands continued, and so did Morell, and that is why calling Morell Dr. Feelgood is too easy. The nickname makes him sound like a man whose entire purpose was making Hitler feel pleasant. The surviving pattern looks more specific than that. Morell was useful because he was willing to keep treating the difference between how Hitler felt and how Hitler believed he needed to function. Sometimes the problem was illness, sometimes pain or fatigue, and sometimes merely the possibility that a cold might interfere with a speech. And when the patient regards all of those as problems that must be solved immediately, the doctor who always has another intervention becomes very difficult to replace. Brandt's criticism matters more in that context. Again, he was not neutral. Brandt disliked Morell, competed with him, and some of the medical circle's hostility was clearly mixed with personal contempt for Morell's appearance, manners and status. So every hostile recollection needs to be treated cautiously, rather than turned into objective evidence. But Brandt's description of prophylactic injections fits the broader pattern we can see elsewhere. Morell was increasingly treating not only what Hitler had, but what might prevent him from performing. That is much harder to dismiss as merely medicine being different in the 1940s, because even by the standards of the time, this begins to look like a doctor expanding his jurisdiction. A tired body, a punishing schedule, even bad weather forecasts for the next day could all become medical problems in Morell's hands, until the boundary between treating illness and maintaining performance became difficult to see. That is a much more useful way to understand the 1,000 injections. Not as 1,000 moments of intoxication, and not as proof that every drug Morell touched was dangerous, but as evidence that intervention itself had become habitual. And if that is true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Was this something Morell did because Hitler was uniquely difficult? Or was this simply how Morell practiced medicine when a patient allowed him to? Because if Hitler was only the most intense version of a pattern Morell used elsewhere, then the story changes again. The question is no longer why one dictator had such a strange medicine cabinet. It becomes why one particular doctor treated people the way he did. By the middle of the war, Morell was no longer simply prescribing medicine, he was helping to manufacture it. That sounds immediately suspicious now, but the first question still has to be the same one we have been asking all along. Would that have looked insane in the 1930s? Not necessarily. Commercial medicine was everywhere. Proprietary remedies were everywhere. Pharmaceutical companies were aggressively promoting tablets, tonics, glandular extracts, and new preparations to doctors. And the medical profession was already arguing over how much of that enthusiasm was science and how much was salesmanship. In 1930, the Journal of the American Medical Association complained that physicians were becoming victims of manufacturers' propaganda and described modern medicine as suffering from a tablet epidemic. Around the same time, medical schools were being urged to teach against shotgun prescribing and the indiscriminate use of proprietary remedies. So Morell did not invent the commercial atmosphere around medicine. He entered a profession already wrestling with it, and the same is true of the kinds of products he liked. By 1935, glandular therapy was one of the hottest areas in medicine, but serious medical journals were already drawing a sharp line between real endocrinology and the enormous fringe of commercial products being sold around it. One major review complained that glandular preparations had attracted extravagant claims and noted that only a small fraction were known to contain material with demonstrated activity. That distinction matters because Morell's favourite therapeutic world sat almost exactly on that fault line. Hormones and vitamins were real medicine, and some glandular extracts were too. But the 1930s medical profession was already warning that respectable discoveries had created an enormous market for products whose claims ran well ahead of the evidence, which is where Morell's business empire becomes much more interesting than the familiar story that Hitler's doctor happened to own a drug company. From 1943 onward, the Neue Deutsche Biography describes Morell building a pharmaceutical empire from Hitler's headquarters itself. It stretched from Riga through Vinitsa and Olmütz to Kharkov, and Morell became owner or trustee with purchase rights in 6 companies in German-occupied territories. He also held substantial interests in German pharmaceutical firms, including Nordmark Werke in Hamburg, while Hitler gave him a private research laboratory at Bergische Main. This was not a physician quietly investing his savings in a company and checking the share price between patients. Morell was trying to become a pharmaceutical industrialist while remaining almost continuously beside Hitler. The same categories keep appearing on both sides of Morell's life: vitamins, hormones, glandular preparations, and restorative products designed to improve strength, recovery, and performance. These were not incidental to his medicine, they were central to it, and now they were also becoming part of his manufacturing world. One of the clearest examples was Hammer, associated with Vitamultin and other vitamin and hormone preparations. Vitamultin has attracted enormous attention because of arguments over whether particular versions contain stimulants, but that dispute is almost a distraction here. The more secure point is simpler. Morell believed strongly in restorative preparations. Companies connected to him manufactured them, and the most important patient in Germany was receiving them. That still does not prove that a particular injection was chosen because Morell wanted to sell more ampules. There is usually no evidence for that kind of neat motive. But by 1930s standards, motive was not the only problem physicians worried about. The profession was already concerned about proprietary promotion influencing clinical judgment. That is what makes Morell's position awkward, even before anyone tries to call it corrupt. A doctor can sincerely believe in a treatment and still have a conflict of interest. In fact, sincere belief can make the arrangement more durable, because nobody involved has to feel dishonest. Morell's medical ideas told him that vitamins, hormones, and restorative preparations could help maintain performance. His businesses increasingly lived in the same therapeutic territory: successful treatment. Strengthened Morell's reputation, that reputation strengthened the products, and proximity to Hitler strengthened both. No conspiracy is required when every part of the system rewards the same conclusion. The strongest evidence for this overlap does not even come from one of Hitler's injections. It comes from Morell's scientific reputation. According to the Neue Deutsche Biography, publications appearing under Morell's name were written for him rather than by him. Their medical and pharmacological purpose was, in large part, to present products he manufactured or distributed as positively as possible, and to increase his standing as an important doctor and scientist, which is much harder to dismiss as ordinary business. Pharmaceutical companies advertising their products was normal, doctors being exposed to the advertising was normal, and a physician having commercial interests was not automatically scandalous. But a personal physician using publications under his own name to promote products connected to his businesses, while his professional authority rested partly on treating the head of state, pushes the arrangement into a much murkier category. Morell was becoming prescriber, manufacturer, promoter, research figure and political insider at the same time. None of those roles is automatically illegitimate by itself. The unusual part is how many of them he managed to occupy at once, and this is where the title question becomes useful again. Were Hitler's medicines insane by 1930 standards? Not simply because they were commercial products, that would be unfair to the period, nor simply because they involved hormones or glandular preparations, which were active and respectable areas of medical research. The more historically defensible criticism is narrower. Morell kept drifting toward precisely the part of 1930s medicine that his own contemporaries were already warning about. Vague indications, proprietary enthusiasm, aggressive promotion, and treatment claims extending beyond what the evidence could comfortably support. His business empire did not create that problem, it amplified it. That distinction matters because it prevents Morell from becoming a cartoon. He did not need to be a fraud, know that every product was ineffective, or prescribe something useless purely because he owned a company. He only needed to believe very strongly in a therapeutic philosophy that also happened to reward him commercially, and the surviving record suggests that he did. The scale of the empire makes that philosophy easier to see. Morell's interests were not confined to one vitamin preparation. His network included companies and projects connected with pharmaceutical manufacture across occupied Europe, along with German industrial interests and a private laboratory. The detailed business history reads less like the sideline of a personal physician, and more like a man trying to build an entire therapeutic industry around the kinds of products he already favoured. That is genuine new territory in the story, because it changes what the medicine cabinet represents. The medicine cabinet was not merely a collection of products Morell happened to trust. It sat inside a much larger world of products, companies, research claims and commercial ambitions that he was helping to create. And yet even here, the period standard test refuses to give us an easy verdict. Commercial medicine was normal, promotional excess was common, and glandular enthusiasm was widespread. The profession knew that, and was already criticising it. So the historically interesting question is not whether Morell belonged to an alien medical universe. He did not. It is whether he kept moving toward the most aggressively commercial and weakly restrained edge of a medical universe that already knew those edges could be dangerous. That is much closer to what the surviving evidence supports, and it also gives us something better than judging him from the future. Because Morell was surrounded by doctors who had trained in the same era, read the same kinds of medical literature, and understood exactly what was considered respectable, fashionable, questionable, or excessive. Some of them eventually stopped treating his methods as merely eccentric and began treating them as a problem, which means the next question does not have to be answered from the future at all. We can ask the doctors who were standing in the room. By now, Morell has become difficult to judge from the drug names alone. Cocaine, hormones, and narcotics could all be legitimate medicine, and even some of the stranger glandular preparations belong to a medical world that was still experimenting with what they might be useful for. So if we want to know whether Morell actually looked excessive by the standards of his own time, the best witnesses are not modern commentators, but the doctors who were standing beside him. The useful thing is that they did not all agree. After the war, Giesing, Hasselbach and Brandt were questioned separately about Hitler's health and Morell's treatment, and the American military report that collected their testimony deliberately avoided forcing those accounts into one interpretation. That matters because we are not looking at three doctors rehearsing a single anti-Morell story after the war. We are looking at separate recollections that overlap in some places and diverge sharply in others. They argued about the diagnosis too. Giesing thought some of Hitler's abdominal complaints might have been hysterical in origin, although he also considered drug overdose as a possible explanation. Hasselbach leaned toward a neurotic explanation for the abdominal distension, while Brandt went in a different direction, and thought the cramps and vomiting could have been caused by the constant use of strychnine and atropine rather than by hysteria. Morell, meanwhile, continued to blame the intestines and abnormal bacterial flora. The Allied interrogators also treated Giesing as a serious medical observer rather than merely one more jealous court physician. Their report noted that Professor von Aeken at the Charité thought highly of his ability and judged Giesing's opinions reliable, adding that he appeared to have examined Hitler more thoroughly than the personal physicians usually did. That does not make Giesing neutral. It does make his criticism harder to dismiss as gossip. So even among doctors who later became hostile to him, there was no single agreed explanation for what was wrong with Hitler. That matters, because if they had all looked at the same symptoms and immediately agreed that Morell was poisoning him, the story would be much simpler. They did not, and the argument was happening inside the medicine of the period, with uncertainty on every side, which makes the criticisms they did share much more useful. Brandt's objection, for example, was not simply that Morell used strange drugs, it was that he was too enthusiastic about new medicines, too willing to use high doses, and too ready to act before there was enough broad clinical experience to justify that confidence. That criticism becomes even more interesting because Brandt later testified that Morell, as Hitler's personal physician, had instructions not to keep him informed about Hitler's treatment. Brandt said he sometimes learned what Hitler was taking indirectly, including through a servant who told him about the anti-gas tablets. So one of the senior doctors around Hitler was not merely disagreeing with Morell's judgment, he was trying to judge a treatment regime he could not fully see. That is a very different accusation. Medicine needs new drugs, and someone has to use them before the profession fully understands what they can do. The problem begins when new quietly becomes proven, before the evidence is caught up. That is exactly the kind of boundary the medical profession was already arguing about in the 1930s, and Morell kept wandering toward the ambitious side of it. This is one of the clearest answers to the title so far. A doctor in Morell's own era did not need modern pharmacology to think his treatment style was excessive. Brandt was already criticising the same things we keep finding in the record: novelty, enthusiasm, dosage, and confidence outrunning experience. The objection was not that medicine should never be adventurous. It was that Morell appeared to have very little interest in waiting for adventure to become evidence. Hasselbalch's criticism went in a different direction. He thought Morell had a tendency to persuade patients that they were seriously ill and then present himself as the man who had cured them. That sounds almost theatrical, but Hasselbalch also conceded that Morell could get good results in nervous disorders. The contradiction is useful because Morell does not become easier to understand if every rival simply calls him useless. He appears to have been capable of helping people and alarming other doctors at the same time. The criticism is not that nothing worked, but that his style may have enlarged the medical problem while also providing the solution. A patient feels weak. Morell finds something to treat. The treatment produces a response, and the response confirms the doctor's importance. That pattern does not require fraud. It only requires a physician with a very low threshold for intervention and a patient who values immediate relief. By this point, that description should sound familiar. What makes Giesing especially useful is that he destroys the easiest modern way of dividing the doctors into sensible and insane. Giesing himself gave Hitler cocaine, not recreational cocaine, but topical and local cocaine, as an ear, nose and throat anaesthetic after the July 20th bomb injury. That was legitimate medicine. So one of the doctors who became alarmed by Morell was quite capable of using a substance that sounds far more shocking to a modern audience than many of Morell's vitamins or glandular injections. So the drug name cannot be the dividing line. A 1940s doctor could give Hitler cocaine and still look at Morell's practice and decide that something was wrong. That is probably the cleanest period standard test in the entire story. The argument was increasingly about why the drug was being used, how much was being given, how often treatment was repeated, how certain the doctor sounded, and whether anyone else could meaningfully review what was happening. There is another archival detail that complicates the easy version of Morell as a doctor who simply refused proper investigation. Morell's own surviving account says that he had repeatedly proposed X-rays and analysis of Hitler's stomach contents, only for Hitler to refuse. When this later became part of the criticism against him, Hitler reportedly confirmed that he had been the one declining the tests. That does not clear Morell, but it does show that the patient himself could block the very investigations that might have forced the treatment onto firmer diagnostic ground. So the weakness of the system was not always one doctor ignoring evidence. Sometimes the patient preferred treatment to investigation, and the doctor adapted to that preference. Giesing's suspicion eventually focused on the same black anti-gas pills that opened this story. The important part here is not to retell the episode, but that his concern was concrete enough for him to investigate the tablets himself, and serious enough for Brandt to take the issue further. The pills contained strychnine and belladonna, both substances with legitimate medical histories and both capable of causing problems at sufficient doses. But even here the famous poisoning story is cleaner than the evidence. A later medical review notes that the amounts present in the tablets were minute and non-toxic in ordinary use. Giesing's concern was therefore not proved simply by finding frightening ingredients in the pill. That makes the episode more useful, not less. Even one of Morell's strongest contemporary critics could look at an alarming preparation and push the interpretation further than the composition alone justified. The medicine can be real, while the indication is weak, the dose questionable, the frequency excessive, and the doctor far too certain. That is where Morell's rivals become more useful than the mythology around them. They were not neutral judges. Brandt had his own ambitions, Giesing wanted influence, Hasselbach disliked Morell, and access to Hitler carried prestige, so professional rivalry was never far away. Some of the hostility was also personal and social, which is useful mainly as a reminder not to confuse contempt for Morell, the man with evidence against Morell the physician. Once that noise is removed, the stronger complaints are remarkably specific. Enthusiasm for new medicines before enough experience had accumulated, high dosing, weak transparency between physicians, and a treatment system in which Hitler's personal trust mattered more than peer agreement. None of those complaints requires us to pretend that every injection was dangerous. They are complaints about judgment, which is exactly what the title has been asking us to find. Were Hitler's drugs insane by 1930s standards? Not simply because cocaine was present, because Giesing himself used it. Not because hormones were present, because those were legitimate and exciting areas of medicine, and not because narcotics were present, because doctors had valid reasons to use them. The problem becomes clearer when the medicines stop being judged one at a time and Morell's behaviour is judged as a physician. The real questions are how quickly he reached for treatment, how strong the evidence was, how large the dose became, how often he repeated it, how willing he was to wait, and how much the other doctors could actually see. Those are not modern questions being forced backward into the 1940s. Morell's contemporaries were already asking versions of them. The same era jury does not prove that Morell was a charlatan, but it gives us something more useful. 3 separately questioned physicians, different diagnoses, incomplete access to the treatment, and recurring concern about Morell's judgment long before modern toxicology and decades of myth-making arrived. And the most revealing thing is how little that discomfort depended on the drug names that dominate the popular story. Cocaine, Eukodal and Pervitin all sound dramatic, but the doctors around Hitler were arguing about something less theatrical and more important: method, restraint, and whether Morell's confidence had outrun the evidence available to him. That is a much harder problem to put on a thumbnail, but it is also a much better answer. The conflict finally came to a head when Giesing, Brandt, and others tried to challenge Morell's position, and Hitler sided with Morell. That outcome is often told as proof of Morell's strange hold over him, and there is something to that. But it also reveals the structure of the medical system around Hitler. Peer criticism and professional disagreement could exist, and other doctors could raise concerns, but none of it mattered very much if the patient trusted Morell more than he trusted them. That gave Morell unusual freedom, not because nobody recognized the risks or because the period had no standards, but because the person with the final say preferred the doctor who kept providing immediate answers, which means the most important question is no longer whether Morell's colleagues thought he had gone too far. Some clearly did. The next question is harder. By the final year of the war, Hitler was visibly deteriorating. His tremor was worse, his movement had changed, his sleep was poor, his digestion remained troublesome, and he looked older, weaker, and increasingly unwell. And because Morell had been treating him for years, every one of those changes has eventually been blamed on the drugs. That is where the story becomes dangerous again, because once a medicine cabinet is famous enough, Every symptom starts looking like evidence. The next job is to separate what the drugs could plausibly explain from what they probably could not. By the final year of the war, Hitler looked like a man whose body had begun to betray him. His movements had slowed, his posture had changed, and the tremor that observers had noticed earlier was becoming harder to ignore. This is where the drug story becomes almost irresistible. Morell had spent years treating him. Eukodal had been used repeatedly. Supplies were becoming unreliable, and the war itself was collapsing around him. Put those facts beside the final film of a shaking, stooped Hitler, and the explanation seems to assemble itself. The drugs did this. There is only one problem. The timeline keeps getting in the way. The American medical report compiled after the war describes a slight tremor of Hitler's left arm and leg, together with some dragging of the left leg, beginning around 1942 or 1943 and gradually becoming worse. Other neurological reconstructions push the beginning earlier still. Ellen Gibbles, who later examined Hitler's movement across 83 German newsreel editions between 1940 and 1945, concluded that the progressive Parkinsonian syndrome was developing by about 1941, so whatever late opioid withdrawal may have added to Hitler's condition, the motor disorder was already underway years before the final bunker period usually asked to explain it. That is where the causal arrow begins to look suspicious. The popular version tends to run in one direction. Morell gives drugs, therefore Hitler deteriorates. But at least part of the story may run the other way. Hitler was deteriorating, therefore Morell had more symptoms to treat. That distinction matters enormously because a tremor, slowing, poor sleep and digestive trouble all create new medical problems, and a doctor whose entire style is built around intervention now has more reasons to intervene. The treatment regime can therefore grow alongside the illness without necessarily having created the illness. That, to me, is a much more interesting possibility than simply pointing at the final footage and declaring the medicine cabinet guilty. The neurological evidence is unusually strong for a retrospective historical diagnosis. Gibbles did not rely on one photograph or one memoir written decades later. She compared Hitler's movement across a large run of surviving newsreels, supplemented by medical records and accounts from people around him. The pattern she reconstructed was progressive and asymmetric. Movement on the left side became reduced. The tremor increased, gait and posture changed, and the disorder eventually became generalized. Later neurological work regarded the presence of a Parkinsonian syndrome as very difficult to dispute, even if the precise subtype remains less certain. There is another detail here that rarely survives into the popular drug story. The newsreels themselves were being edited. By early 1945, scenes in which Hitler's gait, posture or tremor were too obvious were reportedly being cut from the official footage. So the visual record that survives is not merely incomplete by accident. Someone was already trying to hide the decline. And by early 1945, neurologist Max de Krinis had reportedly concluded that Hitler had Parkinson's disease, and passed that assessment into the SS leadership. So this was not a diagnosis invented decades later, because modern neurologists watched the same famous trembling hand clip. People inside the regime were already recognizing a neurological problem while Hitler was still alive. That makes the late withdrawal explanation much harder to use as the master key. Not impossible, just much smaller. Repeated use of Eukodal could plausibly create physical dependence. An abrupt reduction or loss of access could produce a very unpleasant withdrawal syndrome. Sleep could worsen, the gut could become more troublesome, anxiety and restlessness could increase, and an already exhausted man could feel considerably worse. But none of those symptoms belongs exclusively to opioid withdrawal, and that is where retrospective drug stories become dangerous. If several plausible causes share the same symptom, the symptom stops telling you which cause is correct. A sleepless night can belong to withdrawal, stress, chronic illness, or Parkinson's disease. Abdominal trouble can belong to medication, a long-standing bowel disorder, anxiety, altered gut motility, or several of them at once. A visibly uncomfortable man in a collapsing bunker can be uncomfortable for an impressive number of reasons. Human physiology has never shown much respect for a clean documentary narrative. The strongest neurological work goes further than merely saying Parkinsonism existed. Gibbles' differential diagnosis specifically considered whether Hitler's syndrome might have been caused by intoxication or drug abuse, and concluded that this was not a convincing explanation for the progressive Parkinsonian disorder. The anti-gas tablets containing atropine were even noted as something that might have suppressed Parkinsonian symptoms rather than produced them, because anticholinergic drugs were historically used to reduce tremor and rigidity. That is a wonderful complication. One of the medicines later presented as evidence that Morell was poisoning Hitler may, at least in one respect, have temporarily masked part of the neurological disease people later blamed on Morell. It does not make the tablets harmless, but it makes the causal story much less obedient. The same review found no convincing evidence that amphetamine dependence explained the Parkinsonian syndrome either. This does not mean the drugs had no effect on Hitler's body. That would be an equally lazy conclusion. Eukodal could produce dependence, sedatives could affect alertness, stimulants could disturb sleep and energy, anticholinergic drugs could create their own side effects, and repeated treatment could make a difficult medical picture considerably noisier. But noise is not the same thing as cause, and once the underlying motor disorder is allowed back into the story, the medicine cabinet loses its ability to explain everything. There is an even stranger possibility. In 2023, neurologists and gastroenterologists revisited Hitler's long-standing bowel complaints and asked whether at least some of them might have belonged to the non-motor phase of Parkinson's disease itself. The proposal is speculative and should stay that way, but it is fascinating because Parkinson's disease can affect gastrointestinal motility years before obvious motor symptoms appear, and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth can produce bloating, abdominal pain, flatulence, and diarrhea. Hitler had precisely the kind of chronic gastrointestinal history that had occupied Morell from the beginning, and stool testing did show dysbiosis. The authors explicitly warn that the historical evidence is too limited to prove such a connection. Hitler's symptoms may have had completely different causes, and reports disagree about how early they began. Still, the possibility creates an extraordinary inversion of the usual story. The stomach problems that first made Morell indispensable may conceivably have been related to the same neurological process whose later symptoms are now used as evidence that Morell's drugs destroyed Hitler. That cannot be stated as fact, but as a possibility it exposes how dangerous retrospective certainty can become. Morell may have spent years treating symptoms of an illness nobody fully recognized, while the growing treatment list later made it easy to blame the illness on the treatment. That is the kind of historical irony the drug list hides, and it changes how the title should be answered. Were Hitler's drugs insane by 1930s and 40s standards because he ended the war shaking and physically diminished? No. The final appearance cannot carry that argument. A progressive neurological syndrome was developing independently enough, early enough, and consistently enough that the drugs cannot simply inherit every later symptom. That does not rescue Morell. If anything, it makes the criticism more precise. His weakness was not necessarily that he created Hitler's decline, but that he kept adding interventions to a body becoming progressively harder to understand. A doctor faced with an emerging neurological disease, chronic gastrointestinal complaints, poor sleep, pain, stress, and a patient unwilling to slow down has an extremely difficult case, and Morell's answer was usually another treatment. That is exactly where the criticism from the previous parts matters, not because every treatment was absurd, but because uncertainty rarely seems to have made him less enthusiastic, and this is where a personal judgment is unavoidable. The withdrawal story is attractive because it turns a complicated decline into a satisfying punishment. Hitler spends years taking powerful drugs, the supply disappears, and his body finally presents the bill. The evidence does not behave that neatly. The progressive motor disorder began too early, lasted too consistently, and fits Parkinsonism too well to be reduced to a late pharmacological reckoning. Withdrawal may have made the final weeks worse, medication may have contributed to suffering, and Morell may have complicated symptoms he was trying to treat. But the dramatic claim that the drug regime explains the shaking, stooping, slowing, and entire physical collapse asks the medicines to do more than the timeline allows. There is one more reason to resist it. If every late symptom is attributed to drugs, Morell becomes responsible for too much. That sounds like a harsher judgment of him, but it actually makes the historical case weaker. The strongest criticism does not need to prove that Morell destroyed Hitler's nervous system. It only needs to show that a doctor confronted with increasing uncertainty kept responding with increasing intervention, often with treatments whose indications, dosing, or evidence his own contemporaries already questioned. That case is much easier to support, and it is also much more interesting. Because now the relationship between illness and treatment becomes circular. Hitler deteriorates, Morell treats the deterioration, the treatment adds side effects, dependence or temporary relief, and those effects create still more symptoms to interpret. After the war, historians inherit the final pile and try to decide which part came first. That loop is more convincing than a single drug explanation, and it is probably closer to how complicated medicine actually goes wrong. The late decline, therefore, does not prove that Hitler's medicine cabinet was insane. It proves something subtler. By the end, the patient was sick enough and the treatment system complicated enough that separating disease from treatment had become extraordinarily difficult. And that leaves one final temptation. If the drugs cannot neatly explain Hitler's physical collapse, perhaps they explain his decisions instead. That claim is even more attractive because a stimulant can be made to explain aggression, an opioid confidence, withdrawal rage, and a disastrous military decision can suddenly become chemistry with a date attached. It is an irresistible way to make history feel simple, which is precisely why it needs the same treatment as everything else in this story: evidence first. If the drugs do not neatly explain Hitler's physical collapse, there is one last place they can be asked to do the work: his decisions. This is the most seductive version of the entire story, because history is full of moments that look, in retrospect, like they should have a chemical explanation attached to them. Hitler becomes more erratic, more stubborn, more willing to gamble, and Morell is standing nearby with a syringe. The temptation is obvious, but the evidence is less cooperative. The Ardennes Offensive is a good place to test the idea because it has become one of the cleanest modern examples. Hitler was receiving cocaine treatment in late 1944, and the offensive that followed was enormous, risky, and strategically desperate. Put those facts next to each other, and the conclusion practically writes itself. Cocaine made Hitler conceive the offensive. But this is exactly the kind of claim that becomes less convincing the moment the military record is allowed into the room. The offensive has a paper trail. The United States Army's official history traces the idea of a major Western counterstroke back to the summer of 1944, with roots appearing by the end of July and preparatory thinking continuing through August and early September. By the middle of September, Hitler was already presenting the concept of a large offensive in the West to senior advisors. The plan did not materialize out of nowhere on a day when cocaine happened to be present. It grew out of a strategic situation that was already becoming catastrophic, and that difference matters because coincidence in time is not the same thing as origin. German forces were being pushed back in both east and west. The Allies were approaching the Ruhr, Antwerp had become strategically vital, and Hitler still believed that one large blow against the Western Allies might split their coalition, disrupt their advance and restore room for Germany to maneuver. Those ideas may have been unrealistic, but they were not pharmacologically mysterious. They were also completely consistent with a pattern Hitler had shown for years: distrust professional caution, reject retreat, assume the enemy is weaker than he looks, and believe that one sufficiently bold act of will can reverse material reality. That pattern existed long before the cocaine, which creates a very simple causation problem. If the behavior attributed to the drug looks almost identical to the behavior the person displayed before the drug, the burden of proof has to move. The question is no longer, could cocaine produce confidence or risk-taking? Of course it could. The question is whether the historical record shows a new behavior emerging with the drug rather than an old behavior continuing through it. It may have intensified something or changed mood, confidence or energy, but that is not the same as creating the decision itself. The same problem appears when people try to use Eukodal to explain the Mussolini meeting in 1943. There is no need to retell the whole scene. Hitler was in severe abdominal pain, Morell eventually gave him Eukodal, the pain improved, and Hitler was then able to continue a long and forceful meeting. All of that is compatible with the drug having an acute effect. A strong opioid can relieve pain, reduce distress, alter mood, and produce euphoria. What it cannot do from the surviving record is tell us what Mussolini would have decided if Hitler had remained in pain. That is the missing piece in almost every claim of this kind. Morell left us a treatment record, not a control group. We know what happened after the injection. We do not know what would have happened without it. Once that distinction is made, the historical claim has to become smaller. Eukodal may have changed how Hitler felt during the meeting. It may have made him more capable of performing the role he wanted to perform, which is medically plausible. The much larger claim that the injection changed the course of Italian participation in the war needs another layer of evidence that simply is not there. The Ardennes case is even more revealing because the chronology actively resists the neat story. Hitler's interest in a Western counterstroke was already developing before the cocaine treatment can plausibly be made to carry the entire idea. By the time the plan became formal, it had been shaped by weeks of strategic discussion, military losses, and Hitler's long-standing obsession with dramatic counter-offensives. Cocaine may have affected him on days when he was discussing the offensive. It is much harder to argue that cocaine invented the offensive. This argument is not new. Long before the modern popularity of the Hitler drug story, historians and physicians were already trying to explain his late behaviour pharmacologically, which is useful because it gives us a way to test whether newer versions have actually solved the old evidentiary problem or merely changed the name of the drug. In 1980, Leonard and Renate Heston argued that presumed amphetamine toxicity could help explain Hitler's increasing impulsiveness, grandiosity, risk-taking, and loss of perspective. The drug was different, but the logic was almost identical. A chemical appears in the medical record, a troubling behaviour appears in the historical record, and the two are connected. The problem, as critics pointed out even then, was proof. The exact composition of some preparations and the frequency of stimulant exposure were uncertain, while the behaviour being explained often had a history much longer than the drug theory. 40 years later, the favoured substances have shifted toward Eukodal and cocaine, but the central difficulty is remarkably similar. The pharmacology is plausible, the historical causation is not directly observed. Albert Speer rejected the idea that Morell's medicines had significantly altered Hitler's basic aims or the course of events. His own answer was that power itself had been the more important drug. That is obviously not a pharmacological statement, but it contains a useful warning. A historian can become so fascinated by the substances in Morell's bag that the much larger forces shaping Hitler's behaviour, ideology, personality, power, military collapse, and years of accumulated habits begin to look like background noise. That line is obviously metaphorical, but historically it gets closer to the central difficulty. Hitler's ideological obsessions were not late inventions. His anti-Semitism, expansionism, contempt for compromise, belief in violence and willingness to gamble politically and militarily were all there before Morell's strongest medications. So the strongest version of the drug argument cannot be that medication created the political program. At most, the medicines may have altered the state in which Hitler pursued it. That distinction matters because state and decision are not the same thing. A stimulant can increase alertness, an opioid can reduce pain, cocaine can increase subjective energy and confidence, and a sedative can slow someone down. But none of those effects automatically tells us which military option a person will choose, what political objective he will pursue, or which long-held belief he will act on. The closer we get to a specific historical decision, the more evidence we need, and that evidence is usually the part that disappears. This is where post hoc pharmacology becomes dangerous. Once we know what drug was present, later behaviour starts being interpreted through it. So confidence after an opioid becomes opioid confidence. Aggression after a stimulant becomes stimulant aggression. Irrationality during possible withdrawal becomes withdrawal irrationality. The drug gives the behaviour a label, and the label begins to look like an explanation. But a timestamp is not a mechanism. To argue that a drug caused a decision, we would want something stronger. A useful test is counterfactual without pretending we can solve the counterfactual. Does the archive give us any reason to think the decision would probably have been different without the drug? In most of these famous episodes, it does not. We would want the behaviour to begin with the drug, intensify with it, disappear without it, or track the dose closely enough that pharmacology can be separated from personality, ideology and circumstance. The surviving record rarely gives us that. Instead, it gives us a man who was already domineering, already prone to monologues, already contemptuous of military caution, already willing to take extraordinary risks and already convinced that willpower could overcome material constraints. Only then does it give us the drugs. That sequence matters more than the dramatic coincidence of a syringe beside a bad decision. Gordon Craig made essentially this point when he examined Morell's diaries against the earlier amphetamine theory. The diaries could tell us when Morell treated Hitler, what symptoms were being discussed, and which medications appeared in the record. They did not establish that the treatments caused Hitler's failures as a commander. Craig pointed instead to older habits of thought. Lessons Hitler believed he'd learned from the First World War, his distrust of professional soldiers, his chronic underestimation of enemies, and his faith in willpower. Those explanations are less dramatic than a syringe, but much harder to remove from the timeline. They also explain why the same disastrous style of decision-making can be found before the most controversial late-war medications become central. That does not mean pharmacology was irrelevant. A person in severe pain will think differently from the same person after pain relief. A person who has not slept may behave differently after stimulation. A person experiencing withdrawal may be more distressed, restless, or irritable. All of that is ordinary medicine. The historical mistake begins when a plausible acute effect is quietly promoted into the author of a strategic decision. That jump is especially attractive because it makes complex history feel measurable. There is a date, there is a drug, there is a decision, and because the syringe arrives before the meeting, the syringe begins to look like the explanation for the meeting. It is an elegant little chain, and history is usually less polite. The Mussolini meeting involved Italian politics, military pressure, Hitler's existing dominance over the relationship, and Mussolini's own collapsing position. The Ardennes offensive involved months of military deterioration, strategic geography, Hitler's obsession with seizing initiative, and his long-standing belief in decisive counterblows. The drugs enter those situations. They do not replace them. And this is where the title question becomes important again. Were Hitler's drugs insane by 1930s and 40s standards because he made disastrous decisions while taking them? That argument is too easy. Powerful medicines could absolutely change how he felt, and some of the late treatment was questionable enough by contemporary standards for his own doctors to object. But bad decisions are not evidence of abnormal prescribing unless the medical record can be tied convincingly to those decisions, and most of the time it cannot. The strongest historical claim is therefore narrower, but also more defensible. Morell may have changed Hitler's physical and emotional state on particular days, relieved pain before meetings, altered energy, sleep or subjective confidence, and made an already complicated decision-maker even harder to read. But there is much less evidence that Morell changed what Hitler fundamentally wanted, and that is not a small distinction. The drug story becomes more dramatic when Hitler's ideology and military choices are made chemically legible. It becomes more accurate when responsibility is left where the evidence puts it. That matters beyond medical precision. Chemical explanations can accidentally soften historical agency by making catastrophic choices look like symptoms. The archive does not justify that escape. The anti-Semitism, expansionism, contempt for military caution, willingness to gamble and belief that willpower could overcome reality all came first. Morell arrived later. That chronology does not make the drugs harmless, it makes them secondary. And there is something almost comforting about the drug explanation that deserves suspicion. If a catastrophic decision can be blamed on Eukodal, cocaine or Pervitin, then history becomes less human. The disaster belongs partly to chemistry, the ideology becomes pharmacology, the stubbornness becomes intoxication, and the irrationality becomes withdrawal. That is cleaner, and it also makes the structure around the person making those decisions easier to ignore. The surviving evidence does not give us that escape. Morell's medicines may have altered Hitler's state, but they did not invent the worldview that state was serving. That leaves us with a much less cinematic conclusion. The closer we get to a specific decision, the weaker the pharmacological certainty becomes. Morell can be found in the medical record, while Hitler's ideology can be found decades earlier. The space between those two facts is where the popular story keeps trying to insert a syringe. By now, the pattern is becoming difficult to ignore. The drugs themselves are repeatedly less insane than their names make them sound, while the strongest problems appear elsewhere, in frequency, indication, dose, novelty, secrecy, commercial entanglement, lack of restraint and a patient who rewarded intervention, which means we're finally in a position to answer the question we started with, not by counting the drugs, but by deciding which parts of the system would actually have looked abnormal to doctors of Hitler's own time. By this point, one thing has become increasingly clear. The easiest way to misunderstand Morell is to keep asking whether each individual drug looks strange to us now. That question keeps producing the same problem. Cocaine and hormones had legitimate medical uses, glucose injections were not madness, and even some of the glandular preparations, questionable as they could be, belonged to a real medical world rather than a private fantasy Morell invented in Hitler's bedroom. So the better question is no longer what Morell was giving, but what he thought medicine was supposed to do. And here, one of the strangest features of Hitler's treatment turns out to have been surprisingly normal. Morell wanted medicine to preserve performance. He wanted Hitler functioning. If there was a speech to give, a meeting to survive, a journey to make, a night without sleep, a spell of weakness, a loss of appetite, a digestive complaint, or the simple threat that Hitler might not be operating at full capacity, Morell treated the reduction in performance itself as a medical problem. Seen from today, that can look like a doctor who had confused medicine with maintaining a machine. In Germany at the time, however, there was already a name for something very close to this idea: Leistungsmedizin, or performance medicine. The word sounds almost futuristic, but the idea was not. German medicine had been studying work, fatigue, and human performance long before the Nazis came to power. By the early 20th century, researchers were already trying to understand how long people could work, what fatigue did to the body, how physical capacity could be measured, and whether that capacity could be preserved or increased. Workers, soldiers, and athletes were all studied, because the body was not simply something that became interesting after disease appeared. It could also be measured while functioning. That distinction matters because it gives Morell's treatment philosophy a contemporary home. The Nazis did not invent performance medicine. They inherited a medical culture that was already interested in work physiology, fatigue, and productivity, then pushed those interests into a political system obsessed with usefulness, endurance, and output. Medicine was increasingly asked not only to restore the sick, but to preserve the productive. A person who could keep working or remain physically capable for longer was valuable, and the body could be treated as something whose useful life might be extended. That logic becomes uncomfortable very quickly inside National Socialism, because the regime also classified people according to whether it considered them useful, healthy, or worthy of belonging to the national body at all. But for our purposes, one narrower point matters. The idea that medicine should protect performance was not an eccentric private invention of Theodor Morell. It was part of the medical language of his era. And Morell himself was not merely standing near that world, he was writing inside it. A modern historical review of the Deutsche Medizinische Wochenschrift, one of Germany's major medical journals, identifies 5 contributions by Morell and describes them as dealing primarily with Leistungsmedizin. That changes the picture quite a bit, because Morell was not accidentally behaving like a performance doctor merely because Hitler happened to be demanding. He was participating in a medical conversation in which performance itself could become a legitimate object of treatment. At least one of those papers dealt with male hormones, and the question of synthetic hormone treatment versus whole gland extracts, which should sound familiar by now. Because Hitler's medicine cabinet had already begun filling with exactly the kind of restorative logic that sits comfortably inside that world. Fatigue does not have to wait until it becomes disease, weakness does not have to become diagnosis, and reduced capacity can itself become the problem. And if performance can be treated, then the threshold for intervention starts moving. This is where the earlier pattern looks different in retrospect. When Morell gave Hitler injections before demanding days, before speeches, or when he appeared tired, the behaviour can look bizarre if we imagine that medicine in the 1930s was supposed to wait quietly until a clear disease appeared. But Morell was working in a medical culture that was increasingly willing to ask a different question. Not simply, is this person ill? But, can this person perform? That is a much bigger shift than any individual syringe, and it is also where the distinction between Morell's goal and Morell's method becomes essential. The goal was recognisable, while the method became increasingly personal. Institutional performance medicine at least aspired to measurement. Researchers studied fatigue, measured capacity, compared workloads, and tried to understand where physiological limits actually were. Morell's version around Hitler could become much less disciplined. In Hitler's case, however, the system narrowed to one patient, one private doctor, one immediate problem and one treatment, followed by another problem and another treatment. The logic of performance medicine had been compressed into a relationship where the patient expected to function and the doctor expected to produce an answer. That is where the system starts to change character, because Morell was not practicing medicine from another planet. He was taking a recognisable contemporary ambition and removing many of the brakes. Keeping a tired man functional, was not an absurd medical objective in 1940. Treating almost every threat to function as an invitation to prescribe is where the picture becomes harder to defend. That difference also explains why the drug list itself keeps misleading us. A vitamin preparation sounds harmless, a hormone sounds medical, a stimulant sounds more dramatic, and a narcotic sounds alarming. But from Morell's point of view, those categories may have mattered less than whether the intervention produced a functioning patient. If Hitler felt stronger afterward, could continue the meeting, felt more alert, or found that his stomach settled, then in the immediate sense the treatment had worked. The immediate result became a powerful form of evidence. And in a patient who valued immediate function above almost everything else, that kind of evidence could be extremely persuasive. The problem is that immediate effect is not the same thing as good medicine. A treatment can make someone feel better without solving the underlying problem, restore energy while creating another issue later, reduce pain without improving disease, or temporarily improve performance while making it harder to understand what is happening underneath. And once a doctor begins judging success mainly by whether the patient is functioning again, medicine can become very good at producing short-term victories, while the larger picture grows more complicated. That seems to be one of the deeper problems with Morell. He was treating a man who did not want to become a patient. Hitler did not want prolonged investigation, inactivity, or uncertainty. He wanted the body to cooperate. And Morell's medical philosophy was unusually well suited to that demand. A slower, more cautious doctor might have wanted tests, rest, or simply accepted that some symptoms could not be fixed before the next meeting. Morell rarely seems comfortable with that kind of answer. His medicine is full of action. There is always something to inject, something to combine, something to try, something to repeat. That is where the appetite for intervention becomes more revealing than the ingredients. The goal was not strange, the appetite for intervention was, and this also helps explain why Hitler trusted him so deeply. Morell's treatments did not merely address complaints. They supported the identity Hitler wanted to maintain, not sick, not resting, not limited, but still working, speaking, deciding, and remaining capable of being Hitler. That is a very powerful service for a doctor to provide, especially to a patient whose political world depended on appearing physically and mentally capable. Morell therefore occupied a strange position. He was not simply treating disease, but helping maintain performance as part of the patient's public and political function. That makes the relationship look less like ordinary private medicine and more like a closed performance system. The patient needed to function. The doctor supplied interventions that restored function. The restoration strengthened trust, and that trust lowered resistance to the next intervention. And each successful short-term result made the treatment philosophy harder to challenge. That loop may be more important than any single substance. It also helps explain why Morell's critics could find him difficult to dislodge. A doctor who says, "You should rest," is competing with a doctor who says, "I can make you functional again." One of those answers is medically cautious. The other is much more attractive to Hitler. And because some of Morell's treatments genuinely did seem to produce immediate subjective improvement, his position was not sustained by pure illusion. That is important because Morell did not need every treatment to be scientifically sound. He only needed enough of them to produce enough noticeable benefit for Hitler to continue believing that he was indispensable. Once that relationship existed, the threshold for skepticism moved in the wrong direction. Every success became evidence that Morell understood Hitler. Every failure could invite another intervention, and uncertainty itself became another reason to treat. That is where performance medicine turns into something more personal. The institutional question was how to measure and preserve human capacity. Morell's question increasingly became what he could give Hitler today so that he could keep going. Those are related questions, but they are not the same question. And that distinction gives us perhaps the cleanest period standard judgment so far. Morell's ambition was contemporary, while his execution was increasingly exceptional. There is another reason this matters. The modern image of Hitler's medicine cabinet often treats the presence of powerful drugs as proof that the entire system was obviously insane. But if doctors of the era already believed medicine could preserve energy, sustain performance, overcome fatigue, and extend useful capacity, then many of Morell's individual decisions become easier to understand. Not necessarily easier to defend, but easier to place, which is what historical standards are supposed to do. They do not excuse, they tell us where the actual boundary was, and the boundary seems to be moving away from the question of whether doctors use stimulants, hormones, vitamins or restorative injections at all. The more important questions are whether the indication was clear, whether the dose was justified, whether the treatment was being measured against evidence, whether anyone else could review the system, and whether the doctor was willing to stop intervening when the answer was uncertain. That last question may be the most revealing one, because Morell's strangest feature may not have been what he wanted medicine to do. It was how rarely he accepted that medicine might have nothing useful to do today. If a patient felt weak, faced a demanding schedule, worried about performance or simply seemed at risk of becoming less functional, Morell's answer was usually to intervene. That is not simply a drug problem. It is a threshold problem, and thresholds are much harder to dramatize than syringes, which is probably why they disappear from most versions of this story. But thresholds are where medicine often becomes excessive. The threshold is not crossed merely because a drug exists, can be dangerous, or is powerful. The decisive question is when a doctor decides that the benefits of doing something outweigh the benefits of leaving the body alone. Morell appears to have answered that question in favour of action with remarkable consistency. That is where his practice begins to look abnormal, even inside a medical culture that already valued performance. The drugs keep becoming less useful as evidence of insanity, while the threshold for using them keeps becoming more useful. And that brings us closer to the final answer, because what Hitler wanted from medicine was surprisingly contemporary. He wanted endurance, energy, relief, functionality, and the ability to keep performing. The medical world around him already had concepts for all of that. What Morell eventually built to provide it was different. A private treatment system with one unusually powerful patient, a very low threshold for intervention, overlapping remedies, commercial entanglements, limited transparency, and a doctor whose success was judged largely by whether Hitler felt able to continue. That system is much harder to describe as normal. So by the standards of the 1930s and 40s, the strange part was not that medicine tried to improve performance. The strange part was how completely the idea of performance seems to have swallowed the rest of the medical relationship. And once that happened, the medicine cabinet could keep expanding without any single drug. Needing to be the villain, there is a perfect ending to the Hitler and Morell story. After years of injections, strange preparations, and increasingly heavy treatment, Hitler finally understands what has happened to him. He realizes that Morell has made him dependent on powerful drugs, turns on the doctor who created the problem, and throws him out of the bunker. It is neat and dramatic, but the older record is much less cooperative. By April 21st, 1945, Berlin was collapsing around them. Soviet artillery was already striking the city, military plans were disintegrating by the hour, and Hitler had made the increasingly final decision that he would remain in Berlin rather than escape south. Morell was still treating him, and according to Morell's own account, the injections during those final days were mostly glucose. On the morning of the 21st, after another disastrous military conference, Hitler was physically and emotionally exhausted. Morell approached him with another injection. This time, Hitler stopped him, and the confrontation that followed is one of the strangest reversals in the entire medical relationship. Hitler accused Morell of intending to give him morphine, but the accusation was not, in Morell's account, that the doctor had secretly turned him into an addict. Hitler believed something more immediate, that the generals wanted him sedated so that he could be removed from Berlin and taken south. Morell denied knowing anything about such a plan. Hitler became furious and reportedly demanded to know whether Morell thought he was crazy. Then he ordered the doctor to remove the special uniform that marked him as Hitler's personal physician and return to ordinary medical life. After almost 9 years, the relationship was effectively over. That is a very different ending from the modern one. The famous version says the patient finally recognizes the drug problem. The older version says the patient suddenly no longer trusts what the injection means. The revealing thing is not merely that two sources disagree. It is that the second version changes what the entire relationship was built on. For years, the syringe had represented the opposite of danger. It meant relief, energy, getting through the meeting, the stomach settling down, and being able to stand, speak, travel, decide, and continue. Morell's entire position had been built around that promise. Then, in one morning, the same object acquired a different meaning. The syringe had not changed. The patient's interpretation of it had. And this is where the history stops being just a sequence of injections and becomes a judgment about the system itself. Morell's authority had never rested only on pharmacology. It rested on Hitler believing that the pharmacology preserved his control. As long as an injection meant, "This will make me functional again," Morell was indispensable. The moment Hitler believed an injection might mean, "This will make me easier to move, easier to silence, or easier to control," the entire relationship could collapse. That makes the ending much more consistent with everything that came before it. The striking point is that Morell was not finally defeated by better evidence, a rival diagnosis, or a professional review. He was defeated when the patient changed his interpretation of the treatment. Morell had survived repeated criticism from other doctors. Brandt, Giesing and Hasselbach objected, while others mocked him, distrusted him, or tried to reduce his influence. None of that mattered enough because the only opinion that truly protected Morell was Hitler's, and on April 21, 1945, that opinion changed. The timing also matters because Hitler's fear that he might be sedated and taken south did not emerge in an ordinary medical setting. It appeared while the political and military structure around him was falling apart. The failed Steiner counterattack had destroyed one of the last fantasies of relief. Berlin was being encircled. The possibility of evacuation had become politically charged. Hitler was increasingly suspicious of generals, officers, and even close associates, and he had decided to remain in the capital. Within that atmosphere, the idea that someone might try to drug him and remove him from Berlin was not simply a medical fear. It was a fear about losing command, which makes the morphine accusation much easier to understand without turning it into a sudden revelation about opioid dependence. It does not prove Morell's version. Is perfectly true, because Morell had every reason after the war to make himself look better. His records and recollections have to be read with caution. A doctor who has spent years treating a dictator has a strong incentive to explain why the relationship ended in a way that does not make him look reckless, deceptive, or criminal. So the responsible conclusion is not that the modern addiction story is definitely false. It is that the older source trail does not securely support the neat scene in which Hitler suddenly realizes Morell has turned him into a drug addict. The historical evidence gives us something messier: a frightened patient, a collapsing regime, a doctor approaching with another injection, and a sudden crisis of trust. That is less cinematic, but it is also more interesting, because it reveals what had been holding the system together all along: trust, not in medicine in the abstract, but in Morell specifically. Hitler did not need to understand the chemistry or know whether a preparation was mainstream, experimental, or dubious. He needed to believe that Morell was acting to preserve his ability to function. That belief had allowed Morell to survive criticism that would probably have ended another doctor's access years earlier. And when that belief disappeared, the treatment system disappeared with it. There is a strange symmetry here. At the beginning of their relationship, Morell became indispensable because Hitler believed a treatment had worked. At the end, Morell became disposable because Hitler believed an injection might work against him. The medicine itself did not suddenly cross some clear scientific line on April 21st. The meaning of the treatment changed inside the patient's mind. That is a much better explanation for the speed of the collapse in trust. For nearly a decade, intervention had meant reassurance, and Morell had been the doctor who restored control. Now, intervention looked like threat, and Hitler suspected he might be the doctor who removed it. That reversal is almost too perfect, except the evidence supporting it is much more grounded than the addiction revelation version. It also clarifies something important about the title question. Hitler's dismissal of Morell cannot be used as simple proof that even Hitler finally recognized how insane the drug regime had become. The confrontation does not securely show that. What it shows much more clearly is that the treatment relationship depended on confidence, immediacy, and control. Once confidence vanished, the system had no independent structure strong enough to save it. There was no committee reviewing Morell's work, no transparent medical team with authority above the patient, and no institutional mechanism forcing the treatment plan to continue because it had been independently validated. There was Morell, there was Hitler, and there was Hitler's belief that Morell was useful. That arrangement had always been fragile. It simply did not look fragile while the patient was satisfied. The final confrontation exposes the weakness that success had been hiding. There was almost no separation between therapeutic authority and Hitler's satisfaction with the result. A medical system built around one doctor and one powerful patient can appear remarkably stable when both people agree about what success means. The moment they stop agreeing, there is very little underneath, and in this case, success had always meant function, because Morell's treatments were valuable precisely when they helped Hitler keep going. That is why the feared morphine matters so much symbolically. Morphine, in Hitler's imagination at that moment, did not represent pain relief. It represented surrender of control, being rendered passive and someone else deciding where he would go. For a patient whose medical relationship had been built around remaining active, capable and in command, that possibility struck directly at the foundation of the arrangement. The performance doctor had suddenly become, in Hitler's mind, the doctor who might switch him off. That is more than a bunker anecdote. It is the point where the logic of the entire medical relationship reverses direction. It is the final consequence of the logic that made Morell successful in the first place. As long as treatment preserved autonomy, Hitler wanted more of it. The moment treatment seemed capable of taking autonomy away, he rejected the doctor himself. And the historical irony is difficult to miss, because for years other physicians worried that Hitler trusted Morell too much. At the very end, Morell was destroyed by the opposite problem. Hitler no longer trusted him enough to accept even a familiar intervention. The doctor who had survived almost every professional attack was finally defeated by the only opinion that had protected him, Hitler's. There is another reason to be careful with the modern addiction ending. It is narratively satisfying in a way history often is not. A doctor gives powerful drugs for years, the patient becomes dependent, the supply becomes unstable, the patient suffers, and then in the final act he realizes what the doctor has done and throws him out. It has structure, punishment, recognition, a villain and a consequence. The problem is that the surviving evidence does not owe us a satisfying ending. The older account gives us paranoia, collapsing trust and political fear instead. And once that version is taken seriously, the final scene stops looking like a medical awakening and starts looking like the collapse of a private alliance. The deeper implication is that Morell's system was never very institutional. It was personal medicine held together by confidence. A normal medical system can survive a patient losing faith in one doctor. This one could not, because the doctor and the system had become almost the same thing. That is a more useful conclusion because it does not require us to invent certainty where the record is weak. The shortage of Eukodal may still belong somewhere in the medical background. Possible dependence may still matter, and withdrawal may still have affected Hitler's final condition. None of that automatically tells us why Morell was dismissed on that particular morning. The immediate confrontation, in the older account, is about feared sedation and removal. The distinction matters because background conditions are not the same as triggers. History becomes distorted very quickly when every event is forced to serve the most dramatic theory available. And this story has already shown how often that happens with drugs. A drug is present, so the drug becomes the explanation. A symptom appears, so the drug becomes the cause. A bad decision occurs, so the drug becomes the mechanism. A doctor is dismissed, so the drug becomes the reason. Sometimes the drug really is the explanation, and sometimes it's only standing nearby when history happens. The dismissal appears to belong more clearly to a crisis of trust than to a proven moment of addiction recognition. That does not make the drug story weaker. It makes the relationship story stronger, and it sharpens the criticism. The problem was not merely that Morell prescribed too much. It was that the treatment system had no strong independent standard of success beyond whether Hitler felt restored, reassured, or capable again. Morell had spent years making himself useful by giving Hitler the feeling that something could always be done. An injection could restore function, a tablet could settle a complaint, a preparation could improve energy, and a treatment could keep the day moving. That promise had enormous value to a man who hated limitation. But the system contained a hidden vulnerability. Every intervention required Hitler to believe that Morell was acting on his side. Once that assumption failed, even a glucose injection could become frightening. The chemistry had not suddenly become more exotic. The trust had disappeared. That distinction is the commentary here. The final failure was not primarily chemical. It was structural, and that gives the final scene a much cleaner historical meaning. Morell was not thrown out because the medicine cabinet finally confessed what it was. He was thrown out because the relationship that had made the medicine cabinet possible no longer functioned. That is the point where the doctor disappears from the story, but the patient remains alive for a few more days, which creates one last useful question. Once Morell was gone, what actually changed? Once Morell was gone, there should have been a clean test. For years, almost every serious attempt to explain Hitler's health has had the same problem. Too many variables moving at once. Parkinsonism, chronic gastrointestinal trouble, pain, sleep disruption, stress, stimulants, sedatives, hormones, narcotics, vitamins, injections, and one doctor who rarely seemed to regard doing nothing as a satisfying medical option. Then, on April 21st, 1945, Morell was dismissed, and at first glance this looks like the perfect natural experiment. Remove the doctor, remove the drugs, and watch what happens. Except the experiment never really begins. The doctor leaves more cleanly than the treatment does. Morell had already prepared medications, and historical accounts indicate that at least some of those medicines continued to be administered after his departure, with Dr. Werner Haase and Hitler's valet Heinz Linger taking over parts of the routine. That is an awkward detail for the neat final day's story, because Morell was gone is not the same thing as the medicines were gone. And once that distinction is made, several very confident claims about Hitler's final week become much harder to sustain. The most revealing object in this story may not be another syringe, but a cupboard. Traudl-Junger later recalled that Linger kept medicines for Hitler and could bring them when Hitler asked, sometimes without first consulting Morell. Earlier accounts of the anti-gas pill dispute point in the same direction. Morell could supply medication in bulk, Linger could store it, and Hitler could request it. That means part of the treatment system had already moved outside the immediate doctor-patient encounter. The medicine did not always require a fresh examination or a new diagnostic decision. Sometimes it required the patient to ask, the valet to open a cupboard, and the routine to continue. That is a much more important finding than simply saying Hitler took a lot of pills. It means Morell's treatment philosophy had become infrastructure. A doctor can be dismissed in a minute, but a routine built over 9 years is harder to dismiss, and this is where the idea of dependence needs to be handled much more carefully than it usually is. There is chemical dependence, which depends on the properties of a specific drug, the dose, the duration of exposure, and what happens when that drug is stopped. Then there is something broader. A person can become accustomed to the expectation that discomfort should be answered immediately with treatment. Weakness, fatigue, poor sleep, stomach trouble, nerves, pain, the schedule and the general inconvenience of being human all begin to look like things that should have something available for them. The historical evidence is much stronger for that second pattern than it is for many of the dramatic addiction claims. We may not be able to prove dependence on every substance in Morell's cabinet. We can much more confidently say that treatment itself had become normal. That is a different kind of reliance, and it explains why Morell's departure does not immediately switch the system off. The patient had learned to expect medication, the valet had learned to supply it, another doctor could inherit at least some of the administration, and the medicines had been organised around the patient's daily life, rather than around a single moment of diagnosis. By the end, some of Morell's medicine no longer needed Morell. It needed a cupboard and someone with the key. That changes how we should interpret the final days. A popular version often works like this. Morell disappears, the drug supply collapses, Hitler enters withdrawal, and the physical and psychological deterioration that follows proves what the drugs had been doing all along. But the doctor left is not a dose schedule, and to diagnose withdrawal historically we would need something much more specific. A serious withdrawal claim would need to establish which drug stopped, when the last dose occurred, how regularly, and at what quantity it had been given, whether prepared medication remained, whether another doctor continued it, and which symptoms followed on what timeline. Those questions are not bureaucratic fussiness. They are the difference between pharmacology and storytelling. Without them, withdrawal becomes a label placed over a chaotic final week because the label fits the mood. The bunker is collapsing, the patient is deteriorating. And the doctor is gone, so the story begins to assume that the drugs must have stopped, and the symptoms must therefore be withdrawal. It is a compelling chain, but it is also full of assumptions. The evidence gives us a more inconvenient picture. Medication continued in some form. The exact regimen becomes harder to reconstruct, and the underlying neurological disease did not disappear. Sleep, food, Stress, military conditions and physical surroundings were all deteriorating at the same time. The final week is not a controlled experiment. It is almost the opposite because every important variable changes at once. That makes the historian's job harder, but it also makes the conclusions more interesting. Because if Morell's dismissal does not give us a clean before and after comparison, then the stronger story is not about what happened when the drug stopped. It is about how difficult the system had become to stop. That is a very different criticism, because the standard picture makes Morell the central mechanism. He prescribes, injects, supplies, then leaves, and the story assumes everything changes with him. The archival detail suggests something more distributed. Hitler requests, Linger stores and supplies, Morell prepares, another doctor continues parts of the routine, and the treatment has become a network. And once medicine becomes a network, responsibility becomes harder to locate. At that point, even the question of who is deciding becomes blurred between the doctor who originally prescribed, the patient who requests, the valet who delivers, and the replacement physician who continues. That ambiguity is itself evidence that the system had drifted away from ordinary medical supervision. The less direct supervision there is, the less useful it becomes to ask only whether the drug itself was legitimate. A perfectly legitimate drug can become questionable through access. A dangerous drug can be used responsibly through close supervision. The substance is only one part of the medical act. Who controls it, who decides when it is used, and how closely the patient is being reviewed matter just as much. That is another place where the title begins to split. If we judge Hitler's treatment by the names of the drugs, much of it remains surprisingly recognizable for the period. If we judge the system by supervision, access and thresholds, the picture becomes less comfortable. The anti-gas pills are a good example. The ingredients were not magical poison, and the prescription itself existed within contemporary medicine. But the fact that the tablets could sit in Linger's drawer and be supplied to Hitler on request is a different question entirely. The problem is no longer simply what the tablets contained, but how medicine circulated around the patient. That is where the story starts looking less like unusual pharmacology and more like unusual medical governance. And that distinction matters because modern drug stories are naturally attracted to substances. Substances have names, doses, and reputations. They can be photographed and placed on a thumbnail. Supervision, access, and the threshold for another dose are much less glamorous. But those quiet structural questions may tell us much more about whether a treatment system had become excessive. Morell's real legacy was not simply a list of substances, it was a reflex in which discomfort appears and treatment follows. And once that reflex is embedded in the people around the patient, removing the original doctor does not necessarily remove the behaviour. That is why the final days are so useful even though they fail as a pharmacological experiment. They show that Morell had created something larger than his own physical presence. The routine could outlive him, and there is an irony in that. Morell's indispensability had always seemed to be part of his power. Hitler trusted him personally, other doctors could not replace him, and he had accumulated years of intimate medical knowledge. Yet by the very end, part of his practice had become transferable. Not the whole relationship or the diagnostic authority, but the daily machinery of treatment could continue. The valet knew where the medicines were, another physician could administer them, and the patient knew what to request. That means Morell's greatest success, in one sense, was making some parts of his own system independent of him. And from a medical point of view, that is not necessarily a compliment. A good treatment plan can certainly continue when one doctor leaves, and that is normal. The problem is what exactly is being continued. A transparent regimen with documented indications and clear dosing is one thing. A collection of prepared medicines, patient requests, and inherited routines is another. The difference is not obvious from a list of substances, it is obvious from the structure around them. That is why the final week should make us more cautious about the word addiction. Chemical addiction is a specific claim, while system dependence is a broader one. The evidence for the first varies dramatically depending on the drug, while the evidence for the second is much easier to see. Hitler had become accustomed to a world in which medicine was available immediately, where symptoms triggered intervention quickly, where treatments were stored close at hand, and where function was something the doctor was expected to restore. That world does not disappear when Morell walks out of the bunker, and that may be the most revealing thing about the end of the story. Morell could leave Berlin, but his central medical idea stayed behind. When Hitler felt something, there should be something to take for it. The final days do not prove that every drug had become necessary. They show that intervention itself had become normal, and that is a much stronger historical criticism because it does not depend on diagnosing a dramatic withdrawal syndrome from incomplete evidence. It depends on something we can actually see in the structure of the treatment. The medicines were accessible, the patient expected them, the people around him knew how to provide them, and the doctor's absence did not immediately break the routine. That is not a story about one shocking substance. It is a story about a medical system losing the ordinary breaks that make powerful medicine ordinary medicine. By now, the question is no longer whether one spectacular drug made Hitler's treatment insane. The better question is whether the system had become so accustomed to intervention that doing nothing had stopped being a serious option. And once that happens, almost any medicine can become too much. For most of this story, the easiest mistake has been to look at the names inside Hitler's medicine cabinet and judge them by how alarming they sound now. Cocaine, Eukodal, Pervitin, hormones and sedatives all sound alarming enough that the natural reaction is to ask how any doctor could possibly have thought this was normal. But there is an opposite mistake that is just as easy to make. Once we learn that some of these drugs were legitimate medicines in the 1930s, the entire cabinet can start looking ordinary by default. That is not quite right either, because legitimate medicine is not the same thing as casual medicine. Germany had already begun building legal and medical controls around powerful narcotics before Hitler ever met Morell. In 1929, a new German Opium Act tightened the regulation of narcotic drugs, and contemporary reporting made clear that the concern was not merely international trade. The law was also aimed at abusive prescribing and use. That matters because some of the substances later associated with Hitler were already inside that regulated world, and Eukodal was one of them. So by the time Morell entered Hitler's life in 1936, German medicine did not need 21st century hindsight to know that a drug like Eukodal deserved respect. The state had already decided that respect should be written into rules. A further prescribing ordinance followed in 1930, and contemporary medical reporting described restrictions on who could prescribe certain narcotics and cocaine, the medical indications under which they could be used, the quantities involved, and the combinations that were allowed. That is a very different picture from a medical culture wandering around innocently with powerful drugs and no idea what they might do. The 1930s did not greet cocaine with innocence. They greeted it with paperwork, and that paperwork may tell us more about contemporary standards than the medicine cabinet itself. The cabinet tells us what substances existed, while the ledger tells us what the era thought required control. Doctors dealing with morphine and cocaine could be expected to keep records that made receipt and dispensing traceable. German legal and medical history describes so-called morphine and cocaine books in which controlled stock had to be documented. For cocaine prescribing, the illness that justified the prescription could itself become part of the record. That detail is remarkably useful because it tells us that indication was not some modern obsession invented after decades of drug scandals. Doctors of the period were already being asked, in effect, why does this patient need this? How much is being used? Where did the drug come from and where did it go? Those are very modern-sounding questions, but they are also very old questions, and they change how we should judge Morell. The point is not that Morell must therefore have been breaking the law. There is no reason to claim that without direct evidence. The point is that his own medical world already understood that powerful drugs required breaks. That is a much stronger historical benchmark because the case against Morell does not need modern drug policy. His own era had already built systems around indication, quantity, documentation, and supervision. So when his practice starts to look questionable, the question is not whether we are unfairly imposing modern caution on an older doctor. The better question is whether his private system around Hitler relied increasingly on personal trust, where ordinary medicine was already trying to rely on procedure. That is a much more precise criticism, and it also gives us a way to untangle the word normal. Cocaine was normal in the sense that doctors used it, but not in the sense that nobody worried about it. Eukodal was normal in the sense that it was a recognized pharmaceutical analgesic. It was not normal in the sense that nobody recognized abuse or dependence risk. Pervitin was normal in the sense that it entered civilian and military medicine as a real pharmaceutical product. It was not normal in the sense that concern never developed. The period itself refuses the simple answer. These drugs were normal enough to prescribe and serious enough to regulate. That distinction is probably more useful than asking whether a substance was legal. Legal is a very low bar because a treatment can be perfectly legal and still be excessive. A doctor can remain inside the formal rules and still prescribe too often, use weak indications, combine too many interventions, fail to coordinate with other physicians, or treat every complaint as an opportunity to act. Law tells us the minimum boundary, medicine asks a harder question, and Hitler's treatment increasingly lives in that harder territory. The best example may be the contrast between the narcotics ledger and the medicine cupboard. On one side, contemporary medicine is developing systems intended to trace controlled substances, document why they are being used and restrict access. On the other, we have a private medical environment in which some medicines could be stored near Hitler, requested by him, and delivered through his valet. That does not prove anyone broke a law, but it does show why the cupboard matters. The cupboard matters more once we know the era had already invented the ledger, because the problem is no longer simply whether the drug itself was legitimate. The problem becomes how much supervision surrounded its use. That is a different level of judgment. A powerful drug under close supervision is one thing, while the same drug circulating through a routine where access can become patient-driven is another. The chemistry has not changed, the governance has, and this is where the title becomes much harder to answer with a single yes or no. If we ask whether German doctors in the 1930s used cocaine, opioids, hormones, stimulants and sedatives, the answer is obviously yes. If we ask whether the same doctors believed those substances were harmless, the answer is obviously no. Their rules, criticism and prescribing controls all prove that. The medical culture itself was already trying to separate legitimate use from excessive use. That means the question was never really whether doctors used these drugs, but under what conditions they thought the drug should be used. That is the standard that matters, and the answer keeps circling back to the same themes. Clear indication, controlled access, reasonable quantity, documentation, supervision, and restraint. Those are not modern inventions being imported into the past. They were already present, at least in recognizable form, in the medical world around Morell. That is what makes this such an important correction to the popular story. The common version tends to place Hitler on one side of a historical divide, and modern medicine on the other. Back then, supposedly, doctors casually handed out cocaine and opioids because nobody understood the risks. The real history is much less flattering to that simplification. Doctors then knew enough to regulate, document, argue about dose and indication, worry about abuse, and tighten rules when new drugs caused new problems. The standards were imperfect, the evidence base was weaker, and the pharmacology was less developed, but concern already existed, which makes Morell easier to judge fairly. We do not need to ask whether he violated standards that did not yet exist. We can ask whether his practice drifted toward the edges of standards that already did. Pervitin shows how quickly those standards could move, because when methamphetamine entered German medicine, enthusiasm came first. The drug promised wakefulness, energy and performance, which made it attractive in exactly the kind of medical culture already interested in fatigue and productivity. Then the problems became harder to ignore, medical criticism grew, and restrictions tightened. By 1941, Pervitin had been brought under the narcotics regime. That timeline matters because it destroys another lazy idea. There was no single frozen thing called 1930s medical standards. Standards were changing while Morell was practicing, and doctors were learning in real time. A drug could move from fashionable to questioned to controlled within the span of Hitler's relationship with Morell. That means Morell was not practicing inside a static world where anything pharmaceutical automatically remained acceptable because it had once been marketed. The profession itself was adjusting, and Morell's willingness to keep intervening has to be judged against that moving background. That is where his enthusiasm starts to matter, more than the mere existence of the drugs. The strongest criticism is not that he possessed medicine his contemporaries had never heard of. It is that he seems repeatedly drawn toward action even while. The culture around him was becoming more careful about how powerful treatments should be handled. That is a very different picture from the cartoon version. The cartoon says Morell was a mad doctor using insane drugs in an age that did not know any better. The evidence points somewhere subtler. Morell was a doctor using many recognizable medicines in an age that knew quite a lot about the need for restraint, even if it did not always know exactly where restraint should begin. That is more uncomfortable, because it removes ignorance as an easy excuse. Nobody in 1936 needed a modern addiction textbook to understand that Eukodal was a serious narcotic. Nobody needed a modern drug war to understand that cocaine required control, and by the early 1940s nobody could reasonably claim that Pervitin existed in a medical vacuum untouched by concern. The era had already invented breaks, and the question is how much those breaks mattered inside Hitler's private medical world. That is where the ledger and the cupboard begin telling different stories. The ledger represents the ideal of traceability, while the cupboard represents convenience. The ledger asks why the drug is being used. The cupboard answers because the patient wants it now. That contrast is not absolute, because real medicine is always messier than regulation. Doctors improvise, patients request things, and rules are imperfectly followed. But the contrast still matters because it tells us what contemporary medicine was trying to control. And once that ideal exists, deviations from it become historically meaningful. The most important thing here is that regulation does not prove excess. It gives us a benchmark for recognizing excess, and that subtle distinction matters enormously. A narcotics law does not tell us that every narcotic prescription is suspicious. It tells us that the society creating the law already believed these substances deserved special scrutiny. A cocaine ledger does not tell us that cocaine was unacceptable. It tells us that cocaine was acceptable under conditions. That is almost the entire title question in miniature. Hitler's drug use was not insane simply because the drugs existed. But neither was it automatically ordinary simply because doctors of the era could prescribe them. The real judgment lives in the conditions, why the drug was being used, how often, at what dose, under whose supervision, whether the indication was clear, whether the patient was being monitored, whether other doctors could understand what was happening, and whether uncertainty ever caused treatment to slow down. Those questions are where Morell becomes increasingly difficult to defend, and they are also where the story becomes more historically honest. Because the drugs themselves stop carrying the moral weight. The system carries it. That is probably the clearest distinction we have reached. The medicine cabinet tells us what Hitler took, while the ledger tells us what his era thought deserved caution. And the gap between those two is where Morell's practice has to be judged. So were these drugs actually normal by the standards of the 1930s? Yes, in the sense that they belong to real medicine. No, in the sense that their risks were invisible or their use was casual. The strongest drugs in Hitler's treatment were already surrounded by rules because doctors knew they could go wrong. That leaves us with a much more precise answer than either sensational version. The drugs were not alien, the risks were not unknown, and normal medicine already had breaks. What made Hitler's treatment increasingly extraordinary was how much the effectiveness of those breaks depended on one doctor deciding to use them. The strange thing, then, is that the medicine cabinet has spent all this time attracting attention for almost the wrong reason. The cocaine was real, the Eukodal was real, the stimulants and hormones were real. But doctors of the period knew these were serious medicines, and they had already begun building rules around when and how they should be used. Morell's real peculiarity was that the answer to Hitler's problems so often remained another treatment. Hitler wanted to keep functioning, Morell liked making that possible, and between them the threshold for intervention kept getting lower. None of that required a secret pharmacological conspiracy. It only required a patient who hated limitation, and a doctor who rarely seemed convinced that doing nothing was the best available medicine, which makes Hitler's drug use less insane than the famous list suggests, and Morell's medical system considerably stranger.